If I would ask people what is the hottest topic in the industry, some would answer platform engineering. Heck, many would say that. That's one of the interesting topics of this year. Now, platform engineering covers many different topics, and it means everything and nothing depending on whom you ask. But there is one topic or one theme that goes through all those discussions, and that's developer portal. And there's a good reason for that. The complexity of modern software development is increasing, and with that, we're getting an increased number of tools and APIs and processes and platforms and what's not. And that's almost impossible to manage for somebody who is not dedicated to those tools. As a result, we have collective madness and frustration. We need some kind of developer portal that will unify all that will provide a single interface for all the developers to manage their stuff, whatever the stuff is. I mean, that's applications and building and CI, many different things. And what unifies them all is that single interface, that developer portal that they can use to manage things, to manage their processes, to manage their tools, to manage their stuff in a way that is unified. Because the last thing we want is for everybody to go through endless number of tools and formats and what's not. And that is why Backstage became so popular. Backstage is, I believe, the third most popular project in CNCF right now, right after Kubernetes and OpenTelemetry. And that tells you something, not necessarily about the project itself, but about the need to have an extensible developer portal that can be tailor-made for what people need. So we definitely need a developer portal, and that could be Backstage, or Backstage-like something. Now, we don't have many alternatives to Backstage, so that's probably one of the reasons why it was so widely adopted, but not today. Today, you might expect me to talk about Backstage, but that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about a tool I fell in love with, and we are yet to discover whether that love will end in a marriage or separation, divorce. Let's start with basics. Why do we need developer portal? But I'm not going to answer it, at least not directly, because first I'm going to ask a different question. And the question is, what is platform engineering? Now, I will not go in details why do we need developer portal, simply because I already answered that in detail in that video over there. The gist of it is that we have experts in certain areas that provide services to everybody else. Like, you know Kubernetes, right? You're an expert in Kubernetes? Excellent. Provide a service that will enable people to create and manage Kubernetes clusters and deploy applications in those clusters without going crazy, without spending the same amount of time learning it as you did. Are you a DBA or database administrator? Great. Don't wait for others to open Jira tickets so that you can do things for them. Instead, create a service so that everybody can easily create production-ready databases and manage those databases and schemas and what's not. Use your expertise to help others to self-manage stuff instead of waiting for them to ask you, hey, can you create a database for me? Don't do that. That does not scale. No one can know everything, so we all need to be specialized. But being specialized does not mean that we need to be blockers so that others wait until we do things for them. Being specialized means being an expert that can provide services that others can consume. It's about codifying our experience by providing services that are tailor-made for what company needs, while still providing simplicity to everybody. Now, if you combine all those services from different experts into a unified API, we get something that somebody can use, everybody can use. However, not everybody wants to use APIs. Not everybody wants to send CURL requests or something like that to create or manage things. And that's why we need, potentially, maybe, user interfaces, web UIs, or developer portals. I advocate for using Crossplane for building that API. I advocate for using GitOps so that the desired state is in Git. But we do need a web UI on top of all that. And that is the focus of this video, building that interface on top of an API. And that's where Backstage comes in handy. Backstage is absolutely awesome, but I already said that I will not talk about Backstage. I will talk about something else. Today we'll talk about a product, a service called Port, a potential replacement for Backstage. Okay, I need to read this because this is the description from Port itself. Port is a developer platform made to make life easier for developers and DevOps in an organization by creating a single platform that acts as a single source of truth for all the infrastructure assets and operations existing in the organization's tech stack. Those are some big words said by many before Port. So I want to see what makes Port special. Is there anything special to begin with? Now we'll get to what is special a bit later. For now, what matters is that Port specializes in two things. I mean, it specializes in more than two things, but two things are, from my perspective, really important and crucial to understanding what it does and how we can benefit from it. To begin with, it enables us to catalog all the applications, services, infrastructure, everything that we have running in our systems. On top of that, it provides a single place that enables developers, or everybody else, to interact with all those resources, one way or another. To create applications, to delete applications, to watch applications, to log applications, to do everything. And not only for applications, but potentially for everything. Azure, Google Cloud, AWS, infrastructure, services, running as Google Cloud Runner, Kubernetes cluster. It does not matter what that something is, because the architecture of Port allows us to plug almost anything into the system. So it is very similar, at least in its goals, to Backstage. But the way how it accomplishes that is very, very, very different. Now, let's see it in action. How about that? Oh no, wait. There is one thing I forgot to explain. Port relies on three major components or entities in itself. We have blueprints, entities, and actions. Blueprints are like a data model that allows us to define what something is. Entities are like instances of that data model that allows us to track all the entities that are based on that data model. And we have actions. Well, the word says it all, right? Actions allow us to define what should be executed as a result of some action. I said too many times action, right? Now, at this moment, you might be confused, like blueprints, entities, actions. At least I was the first time I saw Port. So let's see it in action. That should simplify the experience. I already signed up with Port and I did the initial setup. During that setup, I was presented with more than a couple of integrations, and I chose to integrate with GitHub and with the cluster. Cluster is very ephemeral so far. You'll see later that I will need to tell Port what cluster really means. But that's about it. That's all I did in advance. That's the boring part. You can do it yourself. It's a couple of clicks. What comes next is what's really interesting. So since I imported or integrated with a cluster set of blueprints, I got the cluster blueprint, I got node, I got namespace, and so on and so forth. Now, you might be wondering, what is a blueprint? Well, blueprint is a data model. It tells Port what is the data associated with certain entities or types of entities. So far, data does not do anything. It's not data that is poured into Port. It is just data model, right? And that's the power of Port. It allows us to define data model in any way we want, to define whatever we really have, instead of Port trying to figure out models in advance and saying, hey, your application must be like this and your cluster must be like this. No, we have full freedom to define data models ourselves, and Quick Start only gives us, Quick Start, a base on top of which we have to develop something. But since I did start with a Quick Start, I got, as I already mentioned, integration out of the box with GitHub. And what that means is that I got blueprints, data models, and entities. The real information from GitHub was already imported into Port. So I see services. Those are effectively Git repositories where my applications are defined. I got pull requests, all the pull requests across the whole organization, workflows, and issues, all from GitHub, right? This is still nothing custom, right? Or kind of custom, but I'm yet to create my own blueprints later, a couple of minutes, soon, I promise. Now, every person in your organization will see those pages, but every person or a team should be able to customize the experience, and we can do that through filters. Through filters, I can say, for example, hey, I want to see only those services that contain the word silly somewhere in their title, and that's all I care about, right? I don't care about services so everybody else in my company. I want this page to show me only the stuff that I care about. And we accomplish that through two different means. First is filters, which I just did, and I can save that page. So the next time I come to services, I see only those that I care about. And I can also choose which columns I want to see, because I might not care about all the columns that somebody else cares about. I want to see only the information that I deem useful over here. And the same thing applies to pull requests or anything else in port, because port is really unopinionated. What you see here is what I want to see, and the blueprints and the entities, which is resources effectively, are those that I care about. Now, we can work through web UI, it's what I was doing so far, or we can communicate directly with port's API. Now, there is no real CLI to do that, so that's the first negative point for port. I don't like when I don't get proper CLI, but there is an API, and if you want to code it directly or use CURL or something like that, that's certainly doable. So great API, no CLI, plus, minus. What can you do? Examples, by the way, are all written in Python, which again depends on whether Python is your choice or not. Now, let's see what happens if I go to the cluster section, right? Just as with GitHub, I got a couple of blueprints related to the cluster, including cluster itself, but this time there is no data. Port did not know how to get data from my clusters, because unlike GitHub, that can be anything. That can be a Kubernetes cluster running here or there, or some other type of clusters, or maybe no clusters at all, right? So I need to ingest data. I need to tell port how to fetch data from my clusters and use it somehow in relation to the blueprints, to the data model that is already defined. And as I said before, the interesting part comes later when I start defining my own data model. So I'm going to choose Kubernetes as the source of the information of my cluster, and then I'm redirected to the documentation page. I don't like that. There should be a pop-up within the UI, because if I'm in UI, I probably don't want to jump out of the UI. Nevertheless, the documentation page explains how to ingest data into cluster blueprints from a Kubernetes cluster. And as you can probably guess, that's by installing a Helm chart inside my cluster, and that Helm chart will have all the information that port needs to understand how my cluster is related to some blueprints in port itself. Now, I cannot just install Helm chart as is, say Helm install, and that's it, right? I need to define a config file, a sort of values file that will tell port how to relate stuff that I have in my cluster with port blueprints. Now, right now, I'm still not doing anything custom. I'm using the definition from the quick start, or not from the quick start, from port documentation. Later on, I will show you my own interpretation of that. But right now, let's go and see what port recommends us to do. Now, the config file, config.k's YAML, contains resources. The first resource is the kind namespace. What that means is, hey, whenever you find some namespace, that's somehow going to go to port as information, as entities related to a blueprint. Now, the selector in this case says, yes, but only namespaces that contain kube system in the name. Cool, so that's only one namespace. And then you should map that such a namespace with a blueprint cluster, and that should be the blueprint cluster called DOT or dot. So here you can see the simplest relation between an entity, some real information, some real resource, and a blueprint. And then we have another namespace, right? Kind namespaces. And this time it says, hey, this time I want all the namespaces except those that contain the name cube. And I want to map that to the blueprint namespaces. There are some parameters that I'm going to associate. So this part of this information from the namespace itself in the Kubernetes cluster is related to this data in the blueprint. And on top of all that, whenever somebody stores an entity or discovers an entity related to a namespace, that entity from this cluster should be related to this cluster called DOT. And then I do the same thing with nodes. It all follows the same pattern. Hey, this is a real resource, in this case Kubernetes resource. It maps to this blueprint. This is the data, this is the information, those are the parameters that you should inject or ingest, and there is 0 or 1 or more relations with some other blueprints, right? So because I want to create a tree of relations between entities, not only information itself. And then there are pods which follow the same pattern, so no need to explain it. Now, I have a complaint about this config YAML. I mean, it works fine, it's great, but this should have been CRDs. There should be a port operator in my cluster installed separately of the definitions. So I should have a Helm chart to install port operator, and then I should be adding CR for every mapping that I want to include in my cluster and relate to port. That's nitpicking here, but I'm a freak about doing things Kubernetes native way instead of any other way and then shoving it into a container. But nevertheless, it works as is. But now you might be asking, hey, what are the properties? How do you know what is a blueprint in port? Because without knowing what is a blueprint in port, you do not know how to relay the information from something real, in this case Kubernetes cluster, and that blueprint. Well, there are two answers to that. First of all, most likely I created a blueprint, but if I didn't, I can go back to port UI and see the blueprint itself. And then that's a simple JSON, right? It's just a JSON that has, among other things, some properties. And those are the properties that should match to some real entities. So just check the JSON, right? Would it be great if it's YAML? Yes, I don't like JSON myself, but hey, again, I'm nitpicking here. It's one format against the other, so it works fine. And now I can apply that Helm chart to my cluster, and hopefully everything will automatically start working. So the first thing I need to do is add the chart repo to my local list of repos. And then I need to define two environment variables, client ID and client secret. You can get that information from port UI itself. And that's about it. Now I'm ready to install the chart. So Helm upgrade install, you know the drill, right? It's just Helm. Just install it. Let's see what happens if I go back to port, to the entities, specifically if I go and see, let's say, clusters first, right? Did I get the cluster in port? And yes, I did. My DOT cluster is over there. But that was easy because that's only one. I could have added it manually. If I go inside that cluster, I can see the information about the cluster itself. There's not much. And I can see upstream and downstream relations. In this case, they're all downstream. So there's a node or nodes, there are namespaces, and there are pods. And I can continue navigating, right? From one group of entities to another group of entities, upstream, downstream. As long as there are relations between those entities, I can go from one to another and I can see all the details. I can see also runs, which I have none, because that's reserved for a separate video, but I'll get to that later. There is audit logs, which is not really logs from those entities, in this case from Kubernetes cluster, but audit logs of port itself. I could bring logs and events and other type of information into port itself. That would just be yet another blueprint, and then how to ingest data from clusters into that blueprint as entities, but I did not do that. And then there are scorecards. Scorecards are a way how to put some value into entities and say, hey, this entity is a good entity for this and that. This entity is a bad entity for this and that. I will explore that later, maybe. We'll see. In any case, I can navigate. I can now see everything related to my clusters. I mean, not everything, but everything that I told port that I want. And I did not do much yet. Much is yet to come. Now, port is not an opinionated platform. It's not an opinionated system that thinks that it knows what you need. It's quite the opposite. It's unopinionated. What you saw so far is mostly through wizards and quick starts, but here comes the really unopinionated part, meaning I am going to define myself, my own blueprints, and my own entities, and my own everything to be exactly what I need. And that's the really awesome part. So let's get cracking. Let's see how I can define something. And what is that something? Well, I'm going to define environments, right? I have in my system environments like staging, production, and so on and so forth. And I will start with certain type of application, let's say backend application, right? So I want to define in port what it means for me to have a backend application in a way that is completely unrelated or not directly related with the implementation of those backend applications, right? I do not want developers in my company to see all the details of Kubernetes, the things that they don't care about, but focus only what matters to everybody working on backend applications, right? So razor sharp focus on what matters and not on the underlying implementation, which in this case is going to be Kubernetes, but it could be anything else, literally anything else. Now, there are two ways how to add a new blueprint to port. We can choose from a template. That's good as a starting point. You do not want to do that outside of, hey, I want to learn how it works. You want to create your own custom blueprints, and that's exactly what I'm going to do right now. Now, I could write the blueprint in JSON. It's always JSON in case of port directly in the web UI. I will not do that because I already prepared the file for you guys and girls. So let's take a look at JSON that I already prepared. To begin with, it will be JSON for environments. So let's output blueprints environments JSON. To begin with, we have the identifier, which is uniquely identifying this blueprint. It must be unique, and in my case, it's called environment. We have description, title, icon, and so on and so forth. Some metadata that you can put whatever you want over there. Doesn't really matter. I mean, it does matter. It should be descriptive, but it's not critical, right? The properties in schema is empty, meaning that I do not need to know any data about the environment except the relation to the cluster in relation, downstream relations to backend applications in this case, so it's empty. You will see properties in more detail in the next one. Mirror properties, calculating properties, check the docs. I'm not going to go through it right now. And there is relations. Now this is important, right? One relation is called cluster, and it's targeting a blueprint cluster, right? So whenever an entity called environment is created, I want to have a clear relation with the cluster where that environment is running, assuming that there is a cluster. In my case, there is a cluster, it's Kubernetes. So I'm going to copy that JSON, I'm going to go back to port UI, I'm going to close whatever I was doing there before, and then create a new custom blueprint. It comes with the default JSON. I'm going to delete that and paste the JSON we just explored and click the Save button. Now, before I click the Save button, I should mention that the editor in the web UI is absolutely awesome. It detects all the issues or most of the issues, so it will not allow me to save this JSON, this blueprint, unless it is most likely correct. So let's put that to the test. Let's say that I will change the name of the relation from cluster to cluster X, and then it figured out that there is something wrong. There is no such relation. I will not let you proceed. You need to you need to type the correct relation over there. So let me correct that and click the Save button, and then it works. So the editor is absolutely awesome. It works great. It will give you the information about most of the potential errors. And now the environment is available here on the screen, and there is a clear relation between that entity or all the entities and the clusters, right? Now that was a boring part. Let's see more interesting part, more customizable part that I have today for you, and that's backend app. So let's take a look at the backend app JSON. It has identifier, backend app, some other metadata, not important, and it has properties. This time I do have properties. I have all the information listed here that should be important for a hypothetical developer who works with backend applications. There is a URL that should point to the Git repository that contains the source code of this application. There is an on-call field or parameter that should tell people who is responsible, who is on call for that application if something goes wrong. Then we have language, which can be Go, JavaScript, Python, whatever you put over there, whatever the languages your company works in. The list of all available issues related to this application. Available replicas that will be fetched at runtime. Then we have labels and containers and whether the application is healthy, right? Most of this information will be fetched from my cluster. Sometimes it should be fetched from other entities. Like right now, I did not create relation to issues, But if I did, I would fetch the information about the number of issues as a calculated information that would gather sum all the issues related to this application. So I can do a lot of calculation and relations between different entities. I didn't do that just yet or right now because my only relation here is with the environment. So let me copy that JSON, go back to port UI, create a new custom blueprint, delete whatever is there by default, and paste my own JSON over here. And once I save it, you can see that I have yet another blueprint that says backend up, and that backend up is related with environments, and environments are related to clusters, and so on and so forth. Now, as I mentioned before, blueprints are just data models. There is no data yet. Port calls that data entities. So I need to instruct my Kubernetes cluster how to fetch the data required for those blueprints to become alive. So let's do that. I have a modified config YAML over here that is extended version of the one we saw before. Now the first resource over there is the same as before, skipping it, and the next one is actually important. The next one is the one that defines environments. So what did I do? I want to take all Kubernetes namespaces and then filter them with only those that contain environment in the name. I have some mappings. I will go through mappings later with the backend application because that's the more interesting case. And I have relations. All the namespaces that are environments in this cluster belong to the DOT cluster, right? This is easy because all the namespaces in this cluster are from that cluster, right? Some other relations would be slightly more complicated, but not very complicated though. Now the next one is the really interesting one. I'm saying, hey, I want to take all Kubernetes deployments. And then from all those deployments, I do not really want all. I want to filter them, and I want only those that have the label type set to backend. So only deployments with specific label should be considered backend application, because I might have front-end applications that are also Kubernetes deployments, but they are not this type of application. Now, inside of mappings, I have properties, and that's the interesting part. For example, available replicas field or a property in the port blueprint should be associated with specific field, specific value in Kubernetes deployment. And that value is from the status available replicas in Kubernetes deployments at runtime. And then labels are equivalent to metadata labels. And this is how you fetch containers, and this is how you find out whether it is healthy. And URL comes from specific labels. That's pointing to GitHub repository. Language also comes from a label, and who is on call comes from an annotation. And the rest of this config is the same as before. So let me do Helm upgrade install, the same command as before. I want to upgrade this chart with additional, with the modified version of the configuration file. Again, I would love if this would be custom resources. Why didn't you do that, port? But okay, it's fine. This is a general purpose developer platform, not meant to be specific to Kubernetes, so I can forgive you for that. But not for long, eh? Now, what happens if I go back to the port UI? I can see backend apps still empty, and environments is still empty. What's going on? Well, what's going on is that none of my namespaces match that pattern, and I did not deploy a single deployment that has a label type set to backend. So let me do just that. Let me show you the definition of a couple of namespaces. There you go. And those namespaces have names that match those that I expect to see in port associated to environments. And by that I mean environment dash something. So let me apply that one and then go fast back to port. And you can see that only one environment is there, staging, but that's probably because I was too hasty. I can refresh the screen, and then both environments are there. I have environment staging and production ingested from my Kubernetes cluster using the patterns, the blueprints that I created to match what I need and not what somebody else thinks I might need. And I can go to any of those environments, and then I see all the details, not much in case of environments, much more will be available in case of backend applications, and I can see all the upstream and downstream relations. In this case, there is only cluster, that's the upstream relation. There are no backend applications yet, so let's see whether I can deploy some applications to that cluster and see them as well. So let's take a look at a deployment YAML file that is part of my application, right? I still have ingress and service and what's not in that application, but that's not important. That's extremely actually important for application to run correctly, but does not necessarily contain information important for people, for developers working on backend applications. So remember, port is all about showing, cataloging not only cataloging, there are other things, but in this case, creating a catalog with information important to somebody and not necessarily all the low-level details that matter only to Kubernetes experts in this case. Now, this deployment has an annotation and a couple of labels. They provide the information that will be ingested into port and available over there, as you will see soon. Some other information will be retrieved from statuses and what's not of the deployment itself. And the rest of the deployment is just a typical deployment as you already have right now for at least one, probably many other of your applications. So let me deploy this application with kubectl, namespace, etc., etc., etc. You know the drill. My application is now running or will soon be running in that Kubernetes cluster. There is service deployment, horizontal pod autoscaler, and what else? Ingress. That does not matter really. You will see the information you should see, you care about in port, not in Kubernetes. So let me go back to port, and then if I go to backend applications, and pay attention that left-hand menu is dynamic as well. It contains all the blueprints. So whichever blueprints you defined in port is what will appear in the left-hand menu, which is not necessarily that great because you can easily reach 100 blueprints or hundreds of blueprints, and then this menu would be too big. I would like to have an option to customize what I see in that left-hand menu, to put only the information that is important, probably the root information, root blueprints, not necessarily children blueprints, but nevertheless, that's, yeah, I'll get to pros and cons later. Anyways, let's see whether backend applications are now there, actually one application, and indeed, my application is now visible in port. And I can go inside and I can see all the properties to begin with. We have the identifier, boring. We have the theme. Theme is empty because I did not instruct port how to ingest information about the theme. But you can always change some information manually directly from this UI. There is the URL to GitHub repo with the source code of that application. It is written in Go. It has 2 replicas currently running. There is information about containers, the environment, which is production. And if I click on that link, I will go to the entity of that environment, production environment, and then I will see the details about the environment itself, which happens to have upstream entity cluster and downstream entity backend apps. There is title, when it was last updated, who is on call, the number of GitHub issues, which I'm faking right now because I was too lazy to connect it with actual GitHub issues. I will do that maybe in the next video. The labels, and just as importantly, whether it is healthy. What is the status of my application? Theoretically and in practice, I should see all the information that matters to me as the developer of that application right here, independently of the low-level details of the implementation of how it's really running. And down there, like in any entity, we have downstream and upstream relations, the entities related to this one. And if you're a visual person, instead of looking at a table-like view, we can click on the graph, and then you see visual representation of all the relations between different entities that depend or are related to the one that I'm looking at right now. Now, the last thing, or not the next thing, instead of the last, that I want to see is whether the information is updated correctly at runtime. So let me do some modification to my application. Let me change horizontal pod autoscaler and modify it to have the minimum number of replicas set to 4 instead of 2. So let me apply the change, kubectl, etc., etc., etc. And my HPA was changed, modified. And now let me go back to port and see whether port updated the information as well. That should correspond to the available replicas, if I remember, field or property. Now, this is disappointing. It's still saying 2 replicas, but it's disappointing only if you don't know that it takes a couple of moments until HPA discovers and upgrades, or not upgrades, but scales up my application. So my application is not yet scaled to 4 replicas. Let me double check that. Let me go back to my cluster and take a look at how many pods do I have right now. Now there are 4. While I was talking, it scaled up. So let me go back to port, refresh the screen, and there we go. There's 4 replicas in port itself, right? So it fetched the information and updated the entity that it is managing. By the way, did I say that you can manually change information as well, especially the information that is not available by ingesting data from somewhere? Like I can change the theme to be BOT, and that's about it, right? So you can ingest the data or you can manually change the data. Don't change the data manually. Better ingest it always and keep port read-only. And that would be a feature request for port people. Hey, can I say that everything is read-only? Only? That would be nice. As I said before, there are runs, which I will comment in a couple of moments. And then there is audit log as well. Again, in this case, it's not logs of the application itself. That's logs of port itself. Actually, logs or audit logs related to this specific entity. Now let's talk about other features like actions and scorecards, and maybe discuss the pricing model and a few other things. Now, actions are extremely important in port, maybe even more important than it looks at the beginning when you start exploring it. Actions allow you to trigger, well, some actions. So let's say that I want to create a new application and I do not want to define my Helm chart or do whatever needs to be done, push it to Git, do this or that. I probably have a bunch of actions that I should perform when starting or creating a new application. I can automate all that through, let's say, GitHub Actions, and then in port, define an action that will trigger that GitHub action and also provide me with a web UI that I can fill in some fields and say, hey, I would like this type of application. I have this information, that information, click, and then port triggers automation, let's say GitHub Actions or Jenkins or whatever you're using that will do whatever needs to be done, and that will result in my application, new application running in a cluster. And you already saw that once it starts running in a cluster, then port will ingest that data and show it back to the web UI. So actions are extremely important, but I do not have time to go through them today. And not only that I don't have time, but actions will be crucial for a huge, massive video, probably the biggest and most important video that I'm about to release, finishing, and you will find out about it soon. For now, explore actions on your own until, wait for a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks or something like that, and then you will see them in action. It will be part of something very, very special. Then we have scorecards. Scorecards are just giving us information of whether we did something good or not. In my opinion, it's probably the least appealing feature of port. It's nice nevertheless, so try it out. I will not go through it right now. What I will go through is the pricing model. Pricing is always important, right, when deciding whether we should use something or no. Now, let me start by saying that port is not open source, right? So if you want something that is purely open source, then go for Backstage. Now, I will argue later that port might be a better choice than Backstage, but there is a negative thing or downside for some that it is not open source. But not being open source is normal when it's a software as a service or SaaS type of solution, and port is SaaS. Most SaaS solutions are not open source, or sometimes they're based on open source, but not open source themselves. Anyways, it's a SaaS solution, so you do not need to install anything. You need to install Kubernetes agent, but outside of that, it's SaaS solution and it's free. Most of the features that are available are free, so there is no real reason not to try it out, at least. Everything you saw today is in the free version. I did not show any enterprise version. There is enterprise version, but almost everything you need is free. I'm not sure how will port earn money if everything is free, but it's good for you, right? Not everything is free. There are some enterprise features. Now, let's talk about pros and cons. What are the good things? What are the bad things about port and whether you should use it? And maybe I will touch on how it competes with Backstage. Now, let me start by saying that it is for any internal developer platform that you might be building, having a web UI or UI of some sorts on top of it, it's crucial. You will not be able to have, unless everybody in your company are terminal freaks, as I am, you cannot not have a web UI. Even if actually everybody loves terminal, you need web UI for observability reasons for sure. And that's what I focused most today. And then you might choose to have web UI for performing certain actions as well, which is debatable and will be debated in one of the upcoming videos. Anyways, you need a web UI or any type of UI if you want to have a developer platform. Now, having a UI is certainly not the only thing you need. So it's not that you use something like Backstage or Port and that's all you need. Absolutely not. But it is a crucial piece that sits on top of an IDP. Now, I will not go into details of everything you need for an IDP because you can watch that video. I already explained all that. And another one is coming very, very soon. But in a nutshell, the internal developer platforms, at least for medium or large companies, needs to be flexible and it needs to allow you to define what you have so that the end result matches your system. And that means that it cannot be highly opinionated. And that's what goes well with Port. Port allows you to define what you want to have or what you already have. And that's the top part. And then at the bottom, I would recommend creating custom resource definitions that match that something, or actually do the other way around. Create custom resource definitions that match something in your management Kubernetes cluster or control plane cluster, and then put Port on top to ingest the data and show it on a screen. Nevertheless, the bottom part is not the subject of today's video, so let's talk about Port. Let's see what are the pros and cons of using Port and whether it is a good choice. Now, I will start with bad things, negative things. But before I tell you what are the negative things, let me tell you that I love Port. I think it's a great service. I think that it's absolutely amazing. It has some bad things, but they're not that much of bad things, but more room for improvement, right? I have nothing terribly wrong to say about Port. I have certain things that I want to say, the bad things, but that's more like, hey, Port guys, this should be on your roadmap. You should improve this or you should add that, right? So when I say cons, I mean room for improvement. To begin with, quick start is not good, right? I mean, it's easy to follow. It's quick start, but it does not really create anything tangible, right? You get some blueprints, you get some entities, but since there is nothing running through the quick start, it's very hard to understand the benefit of using Port. So improve your quick start. Give me something tangible ingested into Port, and then it would be very easy for any newcomer to see the value right away, like this, quickly. Now, I like that Port allows me to define everything I have, but some things should be discoverable without me necessarily saying what they are. Let me give you an example. I need to define what is a backend application because Port cannot know in advance what it is. In my case, that was only a subset of deployments with some special labels, special annotations, without ingesting all the data, but ingesting some and so on and so forth. So backend application, in my case, in the case of the demo, had to be custom. But Port could ingest, if it knows that I'm using a deployment or part of deployments for that information, it could ingest replica sets and pods automatically. There should be no need for me to tell Port what are the child or low-level resources, but only focus on high-level or root resources that are important. So, unopinionated, great, but some information could be available out of the box. Let me skip actually Kubernetes and say, hey, if I'm using AWS, Port could probably ingest the data automatically and then let me pick and choose what I want to use and how I want to customize it. Next, there is no way to customize the left-hand menu, which is kind of silly because you will quickly, if you're serious, reach hundreds of blueprints and then your left-hand menu will have hundreds of items over there. Not good because they're not all equally important and they're not all sitting on the same level. So please, 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 Port, allow me to customize what I see in the left-hand menu and make it per person so that I see something different than somebody else in my organization. Now, this is probably the biggest downside, or no, missing thing. There is no real homepage. There is, when you log into Port, you get the list of the graph of blueprints. That's great for designing, but I would like some dashboardy type of page to see as the homepage. and I would have to make it my own. So it needs to be customizable. So what I'm really saying is that I want a homepage to be customizable, where I can put and say, hey, I want a summary of those entities and those entities. I want this, I want that, some kind of a place where I can put the most important information all at once. And finally, the last negative thing is that port is not opinionated. What I'm thinking by that is that it would be nice if it would have more predefined type of templates. I do not want it to be opinionated, but I wanted to know when I say, hey, this is a Kubernetes cluster, or this is AWS account, or something like that, to say, oh, you most likely want this. How about I give you this as a starting point, and then you build on top of it instead of starting literally from scratch. Now, let's go to the good things, to the pros. And now this is going to be controversial. It is unopinionated. And I already said that that's a bad thing. Actually, it's a great thing. For many of us, it is better that it is unopinionated than opinionated. I would like to have a mixture of both. But if I had to choose one over the other, I want to be able to define myself what matters to me, instead of some third-party vendor to saying, hey, this is how you run your applications. That's not the case. Every company has different systems. So being unopinionated and allowing me to fine-tune and specify exactly what matters to me is a killer. It's a great feature. Next, it is very user-friendly, right? It is more user-friendly than Backstage. It has nicer UI. It is easier to add and remove things. I do not have to write code in JavaScript. I do not need to compile. I do not need to redeploy stuff. So it is user-friendly both for the end users and for the designers, for people who are defining, in case of port, blueprints and entities. Now, since I already mentioned JavaScript, let me state that there is no need to write code. You can define absolutely everything as JSON. Now, you do need to write code, but that code is outside of port, right? So you will have to write code of your pipelines that will be triggered by actions from port, but port itself is declarative. Through JSON, I would like YAML, but hey. Anyways, no need to write code in port. There is need to write code outside port. And finally, it solves two of the major hurdles or the needs I need for such a web UI. I need to catalog things. I need to see everything happening in the system, or only the things that matter to me. So I have a catalog, and I have actions. Actions allow me, even though I didn't show them in this video, allow me to trigger some processes that will do something like, hey, create a new application, delete the application, create a new cluster, delete a cluster. So actions and catalog, two of the most important features, and they're there. Now, let me say that I was looking for something like this for a while now, and I feel that port is the thing. The only real competition that I know of would be Backstage. And Backstage is great in many different aspects. It is a very popular project. It has a lot of contributions. It is open source and so on and so forth. But it's also painful, not necessarily for end users, but for those modifying and creating the final experience. Backstage can be painful, and it is painful, I believe, unless you're a TypeScript ninja. And port gave me that simplicity that I was looking for. So what I'm trying to say is that I love the idea of Backstage. I do not necessarily love Backstage itself, at least not for all types of users. If you're dedicated on having a full team developing your developer experience and IDP, 10 people, then Backstage is great because you can have 1 or 2 people dedicated to Backstage. But most companies do not have that capacity or do not want to spend that amount of time on it, and then port comes in very, very handy. It allows me to do things infinitely faster than I would do in Backstage. So that's about it. Try it out. I'm sure you will like it. And let me know in the comments, what are you using? Do you like the idea of port? Are you already using Backstage? Do you use something else? Let me know in the comments. See you next time. Cheers.